Hello everybody and welcome to the channel. My name is Ricky Fraley and today I will be talking about the mysterious long-standing case of Sweden's assassinated Prime Minister. Mr. Olof Palme, which is his name, was the Prime Minister of Sweden up until his death in office in 1986. And the case stayed open until actually last year in 2020 when the Swedish police finally came out with and publicly closed the case. As you can probably imagine, as a politician, you make lots of friends, you make a lot of people happy, but on the flip side, you also tend to make a lot of enemies. And those enemies can be in pretty high places, which, of course, is the reason behind there being so many theories and guesses as to who might have been behind this crime and why. And we'll get into all of that in just a moment. But I would like to start off with a little bit of a timeline on his life up until he took office. So, Olof Palme was born in Stockholm, Sweden on January 30th, 1927. I know that might sound like a long time ago. In fact, it's a little less than 100 years ago. But it's important to keep in mind that people nowadays, at least, can live to well above 100 years old. So he very well could still be alive today. He'd just be pretty old, but he'd probably be enjoying himself. I couldn't find very much about his early childhood between 1927 when he was born and about 1945 when he turned 18. There wasn't a lot that I could find on that with my resources, I guess. But I do know that in 1945 to 1947, so just after World War II ended, he answered the call of his country and served a compulsory term in the Swedish military. He served in their army at the Svea Artillery Regiment. And as I say Svea, I don't speak Swedish, so any of the names or anything that's Swedish, I might just mispronounce it. I apologize in advance for anybody who is, I guess, a pronunciation stickler. I'm sorry. But he served in their army at the Svea Artillery Regiment from 1945 to 1947. After he was discharged, he enrolled at Stockholm University, and according to a classmate and one of his friends, Henry J. Abraham, and this is, quote, he had wanted to go to school in the States, being the United States of America. He never made entirely clear why, and also, so he turned to his grandfather, who was a Lutheran bishop in Sweden at the time. His grandfather said he would take care of it, but, and I quote, but you have to agree to one condition. You have to go to a Protestant college. So, obviously to his grandfather, the religion, Protestant Christianity was very important to him. So, Palme went on to seek a scholarship through the American Scandinavian Foundation, and would go on to say, and this is Palme, a quote, suddenly I received a letter from Kenyon. I had never heard of the college, but as it turned out, I was lucky, extremely lucky to land there. And this was in an interview that he had with Kenyon College Alumni Bulletin in 1984. In another interview with his same friend, Mr. Abraham, he gave a little story about how it was to be around Mr. Palme at the time when they were in college. See, the scholarship that he got through the American Scandinavian Foundation to go to Kenyon required him to have a job on campus. There's a lot of people who do work-study programs and similar things like that. Well, he had to carry a job on campus. He had to work pretty much. However, he did receive, according to Mr. Abraham, 47 cents per meal and all that they could eat. They were serving as waiters, so I assume that he means that they got 47 cents, I don't know, per meal in 1945. I don't know what the conversion on that is. I don't know if that's a lot of money. I feel like it was back then, but then again also not, because it wasn't like the 1800s. I don't know, I I guess that goes to show how much I knew about money back then. But he said they got 47 cents per meal. I'm assuming that's per person that they served, as they were waiters, and they got all that they could eat, so they didn't have to pay for food, which is pretty nice, because food's expensive. He, being Abraham again, also said that at one point they put up a sign in in their area reminding the waiters to wear neckties, and that one day Mr. Palme, Olof, came to work with a necktie on but no shirt and pointed at the sign saying that, all you said to wear was a necktie, you didn't say anything about a shirt, so, I mean, he's got jokes, right? Obviously he got sent back to go put a shirt on, but he's got jokes. I mean, he seemed like a pretty pleasant dude, at the very least. So, after he graduated from Kenyon with a degree in economics and political science, he wanted to go throughout the United States and just sightsee, I guess. So he ended up hitchhiking through 34 of the 48 continental United States, and he took odd jobs here and there when he could. The experience in America really helped to open his eyes to the social, political, and economic disparities throughout the country. And the thing about America is that it holds itself up as a paragon of virtue and inclusion, but back then, in the 40s and 50s, I can tell you, that was not exactly what it was. So that experience really opened his eyes to what was going on here. In an interview in 1971, when he was speaking on his travels back in 1948, right after he graduated, he said, and I quote, "For the first time, I came out of isolated Sweden. And that trip had given him a good picture of American society. It gave me strong feelings about social injustices." So, if that can tell you anything about how American society was back in 1948 and 49 era, then there you go. It gave him strong feelings about social injustices. It also sparked a passion for socialism in him, which, I mean, if anywhere is going to spark a passion for socialism, it would probably be capitalist America. But in 1949, he returned to Sweden to study law at Stockholm University. Remember, that's the original university that he enrolled in after he got out of the army. In 1953, he took a trip through Asia and saw the direct result that colonialism and imperialism had on the lives of those people that were under the foot of the empire, as opposed to the people who were on the top, who were enjoying the benefits. In 1957, he went on to be elected to Parliament as a member of the Social Democratic Party. That was almost bad. In 1963, he joins cabinet as the minister without portfolio. And I want to say ironically, but also kind of sadly, his first official duty in office as the minister without portfolio was to attend the funeral of President John F. Kennedy, who had just been assassinated on November 22nd of that year. So that was his first official duty as, a minister in Parliament of Sweden, was to go to the funeral of JFK, which, was a big thing here in America, obviously. In 1968, he gained, I would say, he garnered a lot of probably negative attention from the United States by attending a protest against American involvement in Vietnam, going with a North Vietnamese diplomat. So you can imagine that America didn't like that very much. At this time, the Vietnam conflict, as we call it here in America, was going on, and he was very anti-American involvement in the Vietnam conflict. And he went to a protest against it in the company of a North Vietnamese diplomat. So you can probably imagine that drew the ire of the American government. In 1969, the following year, he was elected the leader of the Social Democratic Party. And as the leader of the Social Democratic Party, he became the prime minister because his party held a majority in parliament. This made him the youngest prime minister in Sweden's history at the age of 42. Which, I don't know, being the leader of a country at 42, I mean, I know that's almost twice my age, but that still feels young. That still feels really young. It's not quite as young as North Korea's leader was when he joined, or ascended to power, but still, that's really young. And then on February 28th, 1986, unfortunately, his life was taken from him by a then unknown assailant who would go unnamed for about 30 years. A little over 30 years. This case went unsolved from that fateful night in February of 1986. So, to go along with that timeline, I'd like to include a little bit of extra information on what he was like as a prime minister and some of the things he did that might have garnered some negative attention from groups and governments of the world. Of course, obviously, he was the Prime Minister of Sweden. He took that mantle in 1969 through to 1976 when his party, I guess, lost the majority in parliament, so that the leader from another party was the Prime Minister, starting in 1976. But they did get their majority back in 1982, and so he was again the Prime Minister of Sweden from 1982 through to 1986, when unfortunately he passed away in office. He was very vocal and outspoken against the Vietnam conflict, as I said before. He was quite outspoken about it when it was the French problem, and then when the Americans moved in, he didn't switch. He maintained his stance. It didn't matter who it was. He viewed it as wrong, and it didn't matter who it was. So he stood by his morals. I mean, that's admirable, right? He was also vocal and outspoken against the system of apartheid in South Africa. That's a very complicated topic, but we can say that the South African government was not having somebody who did not agree with their apartheid. So the South African government was obviously upset with him being outspoken on, the way they run their country, essentially. He also was the first Western leader, nation leader, to visit Cuba after the Cuban Revolution, where the Castro brothers took charge and flipped Cuba from America's summertime playground, vacation destination, into what Americans, at the time at least, feared the absolute most: communism. 1 week before he was assassinated, he delivered a speech that denounced, actually, the Vietnam conflict. That was exactly 7 days before that fateful night in February. And so that was probably, I'm not sure, I think it was the last major public speech that he had given before he died. And multiple times throughout his life, on and off record, he mentioned that it was the United States that made him a socialist. And anybody who lives in the United States can say that probably is not the most glowing review of America to America. Because America does not like socialism. So let's go over the fateful night in February of 1986. His last night as Prime Minister, and husband, father, son, eventually grandfather, I'm assuming, on that day at 11 a.m., he dismissed his security guards for the day. Now, he did this often because he felt that he did it for two reasons. He felt that Sweden was a safe enough place that nobody had been assassinated. He felt that it wasn't dangerous enough to warrant armed security at all times. So he often dismissed his security and went around without them. Another reason why he would dismiss his security is so that he would look more approachable in public, so that people wouldn't see him surrounded by a wall of bodyguards and security when he was just out and about. He wanted to look like an everyman. He wanted to look like, just because he was a prime minister didn't make him above the average person. So he would often dismiss his security for that purpose as well. But on the day of his death, he did dismiss his security at around noon, at around midday, 11 o'clock. This was before he got home and learned that his wife and his son Martin, this is the English pronunciation, I'm just going to try to pronounce it the English way, I don't want to mess it up. But his wife and his son Martin made plans to go to the cinema, to go watch a movie. After that night, police ended up searching Palme's apartment, as well as his wife and his son Martin's workplaces for wiretaps and other spying devices in order to determine whether their plans had been given away through surveillance or espionage, but nothing was found. At exactly 23:21 or 11:21 p.m. CET Central European Time, on the night of February 28, 1986, Olof Palme and his wife Lisbeth were walking home from the Grand Cinema after relaxing and watching a Swedish comedy, The Mozart Brothers. They were approached from behind by the gunman. The gunman fired 2 shots, one of which grazed Lisbeth, but both of which eventually struck Mr. Palme. Autopsy concluded that Mr. Palme had died immediately on the spot. There was no chance of revival, even if the paramedics or the first responders had gotten there any sooner, or no matter what the bystanders who tried to resuscitate him and help him would have done, he was already gone. The man, as described by Mrs. Palme, had dark hair and he was of average height in his late 30s. The description was corroborated by a couple that saw the man flee after the attack and were able to point out which direction he ran in. Martin also supplied a similar description for a man that he had noticed outside of the theater that day. The man was pursued by one bystander and ran down a flight of stairs along the road, but by the time that the pursuer had reached the top of the stairs, the man was gone out of sight and he didn't know where he went. Investigators surmised that either the killer or an accomplice had followed them to the theater from their apartment because of the lack of evidence that they had prior knowledge of their plans. Remember, they had already swept through their apartments and their workplaces trying to find any evidence that these people had wiretaps or listening devices or anything that they could have used to find out their plans, because remember, they just decided that day to go to the cinema. So in the police's mind, they would have had to have somebody following them to see where they went, because there's no way that they could have planned that they were just going to go out to the cinema. The theater also had multiple exits, so investigators theorized that the assailant or an accomplice also sat through the show in the theater with them in order to see which exit they were going out of and see which direction they were going to go. In interviews after the attack, Elizabeth recalled that she noticed 2 men acting suspiciously near their apartments a few weeks before the fatal night, and that she thought that she had seen the assailant before but couldn't recall where. She's saying that at some point there was 2 men that were loitering around, acting suspiciously around their apartments, around their property, and that at some point she had seen the man who eventually would kill her husband. She had seen him somewhere, but she couldn't recall where. 2 bullets were eventually recovered from the scene. Both were copper-tipped lead bullets, believed to have been fired from a Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum. Authorities said that this type of round, that being the copper-tipped lead round, was very, very unusual for Sweden, as it didn't match any of the 500 to 600 reference bullets in the police department's collection. So the police had never, at least never retained a sample of this kind of bullet for comparisons before. Ballistics experts said that the rounds were designed to pierce metal and would have penetrated any bullet-resistant armor that he might have been wearing, especially being hit twice, because if you hit, even if you're wearing iron plates in your body armor, those plates crack after repeated hits. So if one would have penetrated the armor, definitely 2 would have. Even if the first one bounced off or ricocheted, it would have cracked. So what they're saying is these unusual rounds that they hadn't seen before and didn't have any reference samples of in the police department were essentially armor piercing, so they knew what they were doing. Even if, so they wanted to get it done even if he was wearing armor, which unfortunately he wasn't. The police commissioner did end up saying that you don't need to be a professional, but the person who uses it must know about the strength of the weapon. And that is in regards to the .357 Magnum. He's not wrong. Having used a .357 Magnum myself in the past, I do know that you can seriously damage your wrists and even lose control of the weapon and have it jump out of your hands if you're not confident and knowledgeable about what you're doing with that kind of weapon. The recoil is just strong. If you're scared, you're going to lose your grip. Anything can happen. And especially when it's being fired twice in quick succession like that, you have to have the confidence and the experience to use it. So what he's saying isn't wrong. You don't really need to be professional, but you have to know what you're doing in order to pull something like that off. Or else you're gonna mess it up pretty bad. So this person knew what they were doing at the very least in order to also attain armor-piercing rounds that Sweden's police department, Sweden's police service hadn't seen before, and to effectively use them in the manner that they did with a .357 Magnum. So now that we've looked at the timeline of his life, the things that he did, the kind of person that he was, the kind of prime minister that he was, the things that he stood for and didn't stand for, and the night that he unfortunately lost his life, let's get into some of the suspects and theories throughout the year, and then the eventual conclusion that the police came to and released last year in 2020. So, number 1, Victor Gunnarsson. The day following the assassination of Mr. Palme, the police were given a tip as to a man who might be guilty. His name was Victor Gunnarsson. He was a 33-year-old former member of the European Workers' Party, the EAP, which is a far-right political party in Sweden that is part of the La Roche movement, which originated in the United States. The EAP had actually long accused Palme of working for both the CIA and the KGB, which, from my perspective, pick a side. Honestly, I don't think you'll be able to work for both without being a double agent, actually working for one and misleading the other, but they just didn't. Gunnarsson was outspoken of his hatred of Palme, and that served as motive enough for the police to bring him in for questioning regarding the case. A forensic look into his jacket uncovered that he had recently fired a gun, but those results couldn't conclude whether or not that he had fired the gun that actually took Mr. Palme's life. He was released after 1 week but was kept under close watch by a special task force. However, the investigation into him in connection with the Palme case was closed in May of the following year, 1987. His corpse, however, was found 7 years later in the woods outside of a town called Salisbury in North Carolina in the United States. He was discovered with 2 gunshot wounds in the head. Shortly after the release of Gunnarsson, the investigation was sidetracked by the authorities as they shifted their focus from the investigation of concrete leads like Victor and suspects to holding press conferences and discussing the various methods of investigations that they were using. One method was the discussion of the use of fighter jets to try and locate the murder weapon, which, good on you if you have that kind of technology, but I don't know. I'm not trying to say anything about the skills of Swedish fighter jet pilots, but I cannot imagine that it would be very easy to locate a murder weapon that might have been, thrown in the woods or hidden in the bushes or, something like that. Anything from the sky as you're flying around a fighter jet. It just does not make sense to me. Not to mention the fact that you have to be flying upside down, trying to avoid crashing into the ground while looking for a small metallic object. I guess it could be done, but I feel like there are better uses of time and money. Next, after Victor, is the PKK, which is the abbreviation for the Kurdistan Workers' Party. In the years leading up to the night in February of 1986, several ex-members of the PKK, of the party, were killed in Sweden. This caused Palme's government to classify the PKK as a terrorist organization. Both the political murders of the former members of the PKK and the designation of the PKK as a terrorist organization led to heightened tensions between the general public in Sweden and the PKK. They didn't trust them because it seemed like every now and then somebody who had a connection to them wound up dying, and then also their government was telling them that they were a terrorist organization, so you can probably guess that that's why there were heightened tensions between the public in Sweden and the PKK. This tension eventually led to the greenlighting of Operation Alpha on January 20th, 1987, in which 22 Kurds were taken in for questioning regarding the Palme case by the police when the police had no evidence as reasoning for doing so. No pertinent information was gathered, and all the detainees were soon released. The public backlash for this caused forced the lead investigator to resign from his position, and he later went on to become a successful crime novelist. Many people in Sweden still believe that the PKK was behind the assassination, at least in part. One of these people was a friend of the disgraced lead investigator, Ebbe Carlson. Ebbe? Carlson was assisted by the then Minister of Justice, Anna Greta Leon, who wrote him recommendation letters so that he could take his investigation into the UK. Carlson was following his theory that Iran was in league with the PKK to carry out the assassination. This plot would have been motivated by the cancellation of a weapons deal that would have supplied the Islamic Republic with Swedish anti-aircraft systems during the Iran-Iraq War. That is a very heavy sentence. Now, Mr. Palme was a very, very outspoken disarmament person. That was the wrong way to say that. He was fully behind the idea of countries disarming and not building up their military more and more, which was the way that the world was going at the time, because it was in the middle of the Cold War. You had the United States of America and the USSR in an arms race, pretty much. They were going the opposite way that Palme would have liked. Now, he would not have wanted, essentially, to be supplying weapons to other countries that are currently at war while telling people to not build up their militaries and not buy weapons and things like that. It would have made him look pretty bad. The letters by Leon were classified when journalists started investigating them, but in 1988, the scheme was exposed by journalists for expressing. This led to Leon and several other government officials resigning from their offices. Next is a man by the name of Christer Peterson. He was brought back to the police's attention by way of multiple tips from the public in early 1987. Peterson was questioned at the beginning of the investigation but was quickly ruled out. He was now back on the police's radar because he closely resembled the sketches of the suspect released by the police. So he was arrested and brought in for questioning in December of 1988 and put in a lineup to be viewed by Martin Palme. That's Olof's son from the cinema, who said that he had seen somebody who matched the description of the assailant outside of the cinema. Recordings of the lineups were then shown to Lisbeth, who identified Peterson as a murderer years after the event had actually happened. The following summer, Peterson was convicted of the murder. The conviction was overturned, however, only 6 months later, with Peterson being paid 300,000 Swedish crowns for his trouble. Krona. Not crowns. Oh my gosh. Swedish krona for his troubles. The overturning was down to mistakes made by the police during the identification process. This included guiding Lisbeth with information before showing her the tapes of the lineups so that she would essentially know who to pick in order for them to get Mr. Peterson convicted. Some of the confusion, however, came as a result of the often conflicting reports and testimonies that were given by Lisbeth herself. She told investigators that the perpetrator had turned to look at the crime while he was fleeing, exposing his face, therefore, to her as he ran. However, she consistently refused to be recorded during her testimonies and refused to be at the reconstructions of the crime scene. She did not want to go. She then gave conflicting reports of the man's face in the years following as the investigation dragged on. The detectives then had to use their memories to relay what she had said to them to the sketch artist because she didn't allow them to take notes while she was describing the assailant in any of her interviews. She did not allow the authorities, the detectives, to take notes while she was talking. They just had to go based on their memory. And we all know that even in the best of people, the human memory isn't the greatest. You're not going to remember everything. And especially when it comes to having to describe someone's face to a sketch artist, the person who's describing it will give you the best description, but if you have to tell somebody and then that person has to go and tell the other person, you know some details are going to get mixed up, some details are going to be forgotten. You're not going to end up with the most accurate picture that you could at that point. So, then, in 1998, Peterson was then again picked up by the police in a case which was quickly dismissed by the Swedish Supreme Court. In 2005, a man by the name of, because I'm not going to pronounce that, or attempt to, claimed that a police officer and a drug dealer were working together to try to get Peterson convicted so that they could split a 50 million Swedish krona reward. That's a lot of money. That's 5 million US dollars approximately, if my quick math is any good. Lastly, a documentary in 2006 aired and posited that Peterson was actually the murderer, but that he had simply mistaken Palme for a drug dealer that he owed money to and didn't want to pay, which would have been truly tragic. So the next theory that we're going to dive into here is the theory of the police's involvement in the case. Throughout all of the investigations, there had never been a full investigation into the ranks of the police force itself. There are claims that, at least at the time, there were many officers with right-wing extremist views, and with a few of them openly expressing discontent and even hatred towards Palme and his administration. Many officers did and still do think that Palme was a Soviet agent, as discussed before. Reports state that some officers even celebrated the news of his passing with champagne, which is just a whole nother level of messed up if you think about it, if you ask me. It's possible that if there were officers involved in the assassination, they and their friends in the police force could have derailed the investigation from the inside, leading to the confused, unfocused, and often misguided investigation in order to cover for those that were actually involved. This one does seem kind of plausible, because the investigation did get derailed, and it was by the investigators. They were, instead of interviewing people and pursuing leads, talking about how they were getting fighter jets to go look for the murder weapon. That just didn't make sense to me, but it would make sense if there were people on the inside of the police force who had a vested interest in not actually uncovering who did this. Documents from the original investigation were declassified in 2010, showing that some right-wing officers claimed to know who committed the act. Some of these officers were also involved in what was called the baseball gang.
The baseball group, baseball-ligan, and they got infamous for basically beating up people, and they are called the baseball group because they always had civilian clothing and they always had baseball hats on. So yeah. The leader of the baseball group, he was known for having, I don't know the word in English. He was known for having really far right kind of views on things. And there was one instant when someone heard him call another man and say that nu är han död, den fähunden. And that basically means that he said that, oh, now he's dead, that dog, which he was talking about, Olof Palme.
It was a group of police officers that dressed up in civilian clothes and baseball caps in order to investigate and stop street gangs, but ended up harassing and beating people in the streets, which is, it's kind of like the opposite of what your job was, bro. But along with the greater police force, the Swedish security service has also been called into question on the matter. These theories about the Swedish security service, or SEPO, I think, center around the fact that he had no bodyguard on that night. They were completely bodyguardless. And as I already stated, he had sent his personal guard home early that day at around 11 a.m., 1100. But allegedly, later that night, when Lisbeth called for a bodyguard, no guards were available to accompany them. Ingemar Krussel, who was one of the central officers who worked with the police on the PKK lead from earlier, claimed that the security service was always on call and that Lisbeth must have been remembering the events of that day incorrectly. There was no investigation into the Swedish security service. Next theory will be about South Africa and their government. Olof Palme, as I said before, was outspoken about his opposition to the system of apartheid, which at the time was being used by the South African government. 1 week before his death, he made that infamous speech denouncing the system, as well as denouncing the United States' involvement in the Vietnam conflict. Knowing the history of the South African government, which they would order assassinations and kidnappings of foreign leaders in foreign countries, knowing that history, that led many reporters and citizens to try to connect the South African government with the right-wing extremists in the police force and the security service. So the theory here basically is that he pretty badly upset the South African government, a government with a history of ordering assassinations on foreign leaders and diplomats in foreign countries. So it would have been very easy to link South Africa and its history of doing exactly this to what happened with Mr. Palme on that night. So the next group of people here will be a group, not a country or a single person. It'll be, not a governmental body or a single person. It is a group of people, specifically called the Ustasa or Ustasa. It's right here on the screen. During World War II, a sect of Croatians allied themselves with the Nazis. These were called the Ustasa. And after the founding of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, several senior members of the Ustasa fled to Argentina, where they launched a terror campaign against their former countrymen. So they didn't like the founding or the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, so they all ran off to Argentina, from which they organized terrorist attacks on their former country. Part of this plan involved attempts to occupy the Yugoslav consulate in Sweden, in Gothenburg specifically, and the assassination of the Yugoslav ambassador to Sweden in 1971. The following year, one of the by then convicted assassins was released in exchange for hostages that were being held in an airport in Malmo. He then made his way through Central and South America until he became the Paraguayan ambassador to the United States, which, going from international terrorist and assassin to ambassador to a foreign nation, that seems like a leap to me, but I guess it can be done. He was then extradited back from the US, so he got arrested in the US as the Paraguayan ambassador, and he was arrested and extradited back to Sweden in 1980 in order to serve the remainder of his sentence. So he was used as a bargaining chip by the Swedish government to get some hostages released. So he was traded for them, and then eventually found his way back in custody in Sweden to finish his sentence. This, however, has led some to believe that Palme's assassination was an act of revenge for his having to complete his sentence for the assassination. Alright. So, the next group we'll be looking at is another country's government. This time it is the country of India. Now, the country of India in 1986 made the largest order of weapons from a Swedish corporation in Swedish history. This order came out to be around 8.6 billion Swedish krona. On the day of Palme's death, he had a meeting with a man that went by the name of Baghdad Bob, in this meeting, many speculate that he learned of a 320 million krona bribe that was meant to ensure that the deal got pushed through. This would have greatly angered Palme, as if the deal went through, he would have lost credibility as the world's leader in the field of national disarmament and as a UN arbitrator of the Iran-Iraq war from earlier. Some theorize that the assassination was ordered by someone who had money on the table in the deal in order to make sure that he didn't stop the deal from happening. So Palme would have wanted to stop this deal, and many people speculate, as I said, that in this meeting with Baghdad Bob, that he would have learned that there was a bribe on the table to make sure that the deal went through. A deal that he almost certainly would have stepped in and canceled. So somebody who would have benefited from this deal would have essentially ordered the job. And that's the theory. So next is another individual. He was given in the press the name Skandiamannen. If I said that correct, that means the Skandiaman. Skandiaman was the name given to a man by the actual name of Stig Engström. He's a man who worked for the insurance company at Skandia, which is where they got the name. And Skandia's building downtown in Stockholm is actually the location, well, outside of their building, their front door, is the location where Mr. Palme was actually physically assassinated. It was the physical location of the crime scene. Stig was also a member of Sweden's main right-wing party and was identified as a possible suspect in 2016 in a book named The Enemy of the Nation. People began to look into Stig more when Olof's son, Martin, said that Stig resembled a man he had seen outside the cinema that night. This was corroborated by one of the witnesses of the crime, saying that it was possible for it to have been Engström. We will come back to him in a little bit. So next is another group. Well, it's a governmental group. The KGB themselves. As I said before, some people thought that Olof was secretly a KGB agent. One popular theory is that KGB agents were toying around with the idea of getting rid of Palme during a secret meeting because he had ceased to follow his handler's orders. This, of course, would have been an order that would have had to come from the top of the organization, as he was a world leader, but theorists posit that the leaders of the KGB were unaware that the information on the assassination of Palme was allegedly entered into the KGB's information infrastructure, their storehouse of information, but that the leaders hadn't seen it yet because of the length of time that it takes information to travel up a bureaucracy. The theory on the KGB resulted in, allegedly, an officer of the KGB being questioned by Swedish police on more than one occasion about the death of Palme, but this obviously didn't pan out to anything. So one last group that I want to bring attention to here, well, I guess it's two groups at this point, but one last set of people that I would like to bring attention to at this point, because I have been told about this by a native Swede, is that a lot of people actually in Sweden actually think that the group that was behind this was a group called the Stay Behind. Now, I say it's technically two groups, but I was speaking about one because the Stay Behind and their whole deal is in connection with the CIA from the United States of America. The Stay Behind essentially was a project, a group that was left in many countries around the world by the CIA and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And their job was simple. During the Cold War era, to try and stop countries from falling, according to the United States, into communism, because they wanted to stop the spread of communism. That's what the Cold War essentially was about. The United States and the USSR and their clashing ideologies of capitalism and communism. The United States wanted to contain it, the USSR wanted to expand it. There you go, that's the Cold War. Now, the Stay Behind is special because there's different subgroups of the greater Stay Behind in each one of these countries, and the theory is that the Stay Behind was behind it because of the type of person that Mr. Palme was and the things that he was doing in the country and on the world stage. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, this case was eventually given an official end. As far as the police are concerned, the case is solved. On June 10th, 2020, prosecutors stated that the most likely suspect, and the one that they were going with, was Stig Engstrom, the Scandia man that I mentioned earlier. This result, however, they said was due to the information that they had gathered on him during their investigation into him initially. When looking into his background, he was found to have been in the army and as such was familiar with the functions of a firearm. Now, being in the army does not necessarily mean that you can just pick up any firearm and use it, but it does mean that you have confidence with a weapon, and you will have the ability to be able to, generally figure out how to use these things. And you won't be scared, essentially, of the recoil, of the operations of a weapon. He was also a member of a shooting club, which means that he could have had practice with any number of weapons, honestly. 357 Magnum being potentially one of them. He could have practiced with it beforehand, being part of the shooting club. He was also very openly critical of Palme and his policies leading up to that night. And at the time, he was going through financial troubles and battling with alcoholism, which those two things are always risk factors towards behavior like this. If you're suffering through financial troubles, then it is very easy for a group or organization, could have been any one of the ones that we've already talked about, it's very easy for any group or any organization to reach out to you with plenty of money and be like, hey, do this for us and we'll give you this money. Or, it's very easy to get somebody to do something that they would not necessarily normally do if they were in a better place financially. Like I said, financial instability tends to leave people open and desperate enough to do things that they wouldn't normally do. Like attempt to assassinate a politician. I would say that that's probably something that the average person wouldn't try to do normally. In addition to these possibilities for a motive, he was known to have been present at the scene of the crime as he was working late that night at Scandia. And remember, I said Scandia was the physical location, outside the front of Scandia was the visible physical location of the crime. He was working late that night, which means he was very well in that area he could have been. He also matched the description of the gunman. Remember, Lisbeth initially said that he had dark brown hair and that he was of average height, and in his late 30s. He matched the description of the gunman, and the eyewitness accounts contradicted his own testimony of his movements that night. He even went as far as saying that he tried to resuscitate Palme. The problem that leaves many people feeling that no justice has been served, even now when the police have officially identified Mr. Engstrom as the assassin, was that Stig Engstrom took his own life in the year of 2000. So that's 18 years before they even began looking into him as a suspect, and 20 years before he was determined to be the assassin. So no justice can be given now that he's been identified as the suspect, or the assassin, rather. There's nothing they can do because he's been gone for 20 years now. Stig Engstrom does fit the profile according to the trifecta of guiltiness, as I call it for some reason. These are means, motive, and opportunity. Each one being means, weapons experience, his hatred for his political career being the motive, and the physical location being the opportunity. He was right outside his workplace, which we know he was at that night. Means he had weapons experience. Sorry, I almost said he was a weapons expert. I don't know if he was or not, but he had experience at the very least. That's means. Motive, he hated the man. He was very vocal about it. He hated his policies. He hated him as a prime minister. So that's motive enough, you know? But even though he fits the trifecta of guiltiness, that doesn't mean that everyone has accepted this as the final answer on the case. But whoever or whatever was behind the assassination of Olof Palme, we can rest assured that his story and his politics have reached and influenced millions of people across the globe, and his death opened a 30-year wound in the psyche of an entire country that may be able to begin healing now. I just want to say, rest in peace, Olof Palme.